Hello everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to WHIMS. And today I'm going to be reviewing the Stanley Kubrick masterpiece Eyes Wide Shut. Now this film came out in 1999 and it stars Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who play a couple by the name of Bill and Alice Hartman. And when we first meet them, everything seems to be going very well. They're going out to a very glamorous party hosted by their friend Victor and his wife, and they seem to be having a good time. They dance together at one point, and they even say, "Do you know anyone at this party?" And one of them goes, "Not a soul." And Bill has his moment at the party. He sort of like flirts with these two women. It doesn't start off as flirting. It starts off as a casual like talk and like, "Do I know you? Your face looks familiar." And then it sort of transcends into sort of like this mild casual flirting all the way up until, you know, the women are actually, you know, putting their hands on him and leading him to places. And he says to them, you know, "Where are we going exactly?" And one of them goes, "Where the rainbow ends." And there's actually a really funny line that one of them says, where one of them is a supermodel. She says, "Oh, I was doing a photo shoot in you know, one of the big central parlances of New York." And he goes, "Oh yeah, you had something in your eye." And she goes, "Yeah, about half of Fifth Avenue." And I thought that was actually a really fun line. It felt like a very 1950s style line, like that sort of line. And it really was quite funny. So I really do think there's lots of great moments like that, but there's also really odd lines like "Where the rainbow ends." And he even goes, "I don't know where that is." But that's intentional because that actually comes into play much later on in the story. But Bill and Alice Hartman seem like a happily married couple until he's flirting with these two women and she is flirting with a guy called Sandor who's from Hungary. And he starts talking to her about Ovid's Rules on the Art of Love. And she says, "Oh, I know that poet. Wasn't he the guy who died very young and very lonely in a very bad way?" And he goes, "True, but he also knew a lot. He knew many, many things. He was good at many, many things." And they start dancing together and they start talking about, how can a woman like you be alone in a party like this? Like, shouldn't you be with someone? Shouldn't many people be hooking up with you? And she's just playing along at first, like she acts like she's very drunk. But then he goes in to kiss her and she pulls away and she says, "You know, I think I've had a little bit too much champagne and I'm married." And I thought, good for her. She's telling him exactly where to go. Whereas Bill isn't so easy to say things like, "Oh yeah, I'm married, I'm a married man," and things like that. He's actually quite playful with these women and he's actually, you know, playing along with them. And he's actually, you could almost say that he's a little bit drunk himself. Like he's kind of like going, he's like smiling, he's giggling, he's being very kind of almost, you know, playful with these two women, almost very flirtatious. And I find that very interesting because this film is about the examination of relationships, but it's not done so in a very kind of cynical, almost sitcom or romantic comedy kind of way, where it feels kind of, it doesn't feel like it's treating it almost as if it's like the pitch for the film. It's treating it almost like this is a lecture where Stanley Kubrick is presenting his thesis and saying, "Look, this is what I want you to talk about in regards to a couple's relationship." But that's not kind of what the film's about either. I think this film is a film about desire. It's also a film about what it means to be in a relationship and what it means to... It's almost like a very interesting double feature piece with something like Possession, where it does actually explore the identity of a relationship and how, you know, the moving parts of a relationship can be very complicated in the grand scheme of things, especially when a child is involved. It actually explores those elements almost with a near analytical or near surgical precision almost. It's very kind of brutal. It's very kind of, you know, very kind of thorough in its approach. But what's very interesting about this film as well is it's also a very funny film as well. Like, I like the line about, you know, "Oh, you had something in your eye." And she goes, "Yeah, about half of Fifth Avenue." Like, lines like that are really funny. But there's something very odd about the dialogue as well. Like the line that I said, Bill Harford says when he goes, "Oh, ladies, where are we going exactly?" And one of the girls goes, "Where the rainbow ends," and things like that. They're very weird lines of dialogue, but they actually really do play a role in what happens later on, because what happens later on is Bill hears a story from his wife after talking about, the prospect of whether men or whether women can cheat in the same vein that men can. And it's done in a much more sophisticated way than in Tommy Wiseau's The Room, where they basically just tell you everything out loud. Whereas with the dialogue in Eyes Wide Shut, it's both very strange and very alien, but it also feels very familiar because the actors have such good chemistry. And of course, like I said, Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise were actually a real-life married couple at the time when they were making this film. And she basically tells the story of a time when she thought about cheating on Bill when they were in Cape Cod. And she went to this hotel, and this very prestigious captain had actually given her his number and even invited her back to his room. And she thought for one moment about going and have sex with him. But then she stopped herself and said, look, I'm a married woman and I'm happy. I have, a husband and a child. Excuse me. So you really do feel like she is definitely thinking about it. But then she has that moment where she sort of says, I thought for one moment about doing it, and I thought about giving up everything. You, Helena, I thought about giving up everything in that one moment, but I decided not to. And it's a really wonderful examination of how she reacts, because it comes into play with something much later on. But Bill acts very angrily. Like the second he leaves the house, he's very angry. He's very much, instantaneously he wants to hook up with someone. Like immediately he wants to hook up with a girl named Sally, who turns out to be an escort. And it doesn't go very far. But then he wants to go after somebody else. He wants to find a friend of his who he can talk to and, get to know effectively as well. And he ends up talking to a guy who was playing the piano at the party that he was previously at. And he even recommends... Well, he doesn't recommend the place, but he ends up getting a phone call, a very anonymous phone call from someone mysterious who says that he needs to be playing at a place that's far out in the wilderness, and it's like a manor house, and he needs to know the password for admittance. And the password is Fidelio. And Fidelio is actually a very important reference to an opera where a woman has to disguise herself as a prison guard in order to get her husband out of prison. So that plays a very important role because it plays into something that happens later on. And it also plays a little bit of symmetry because back at the party that we were at the very start of the film, the host of the party by the name of Victor is seen upstairs with a woman who is half naked on his couch. And she had what is called a spitball, which is where, all sorts of different drugs are sort of like put together, mixed together, and then basically ingested into the body. And she gets knocked out for several hours, but she happily gets some water in her, and she gets hydrated, and she quite thankfully lives. But she very easily could have died, and Victor thanks Bill because he's a doctor. And he says, would you mind not mentioning this to anyone? It could ruin me and things like that. But then he goes, yeah, of course I won't mention anything. But you have to be very careful. You have to make sure she's taken home safely. And that little moment is very crucial because that plays into something much later on. Bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. Because Bill then decides to go to this party that has the anonymous password of Fidelio. And he ends up going to a costume shop where that's called the Rainbow. That's very interesting because that was mentioned earlier. And because usually at the end of the rainbow, it's usually a pot of gold, isn't it? So you'd think he'd have an embarrassment of riches. And to a certain degree he does. He gets to wear a fancy costume, he gets to wear a Venetian mask, and he gets to go to this very strange, very sinister looking masked ball where, people are enacting, these almost ritualistic, religious rites, but then they're also having very casual sex. And it's very sinister, it's very bizarre as well, because you're thinking to yourself, it feels like such a bizarre tone from what we previously had, but this has basically all been building, because the film basically talks about affairs, it talks about love, it talks about everything in all its barest of forms. The whole entire film is about infidelity. Like, the first thing we see this couple doing is essentially cheating on each other with other partners, but one is sort of teetering on the edge of flirting whilst the other is kind of respectfully kind of like keeping that idea at arm's length, but has thought about it before. So this whole entire idea about going to an orgy or going to this sort of like this sex party was sort of hinted at very early on, but it's not done in a very traditional foreshadowing kind of way. It's done more thematically rather than, physically or literally. And I really like that because it really goes to show that Stanley Kubrick isn't so much about the sleaze of sex, it's more about the idea of, he's more a playful, constructor of these things. He doesn't like to, show characters shagging outright. And that's what I really like about a lot of his films, is he is a character, he is a sort of director who exercises restraint in a lot of his films as well. As much as he likes to show off nudity and he likes to show off, blood, guts and gore in some films, or show very graphic sequences, he is very subdued and he's much more calm and much more sophisticated in how he approaches things. And when Bill's at the party, he effectively, looks round, he sees lots of people having sex, and then eventually he's found out to be an imposter, and a person summons him to the centre of the room, like this big grand hall where everyone is waiting, and a guy who I'm just going to be calling the Cardinal basically says, "What's the password?" And he says, "Fidelio." And he goes, "That's the password for admittance. What's the password for the house?" And he pauses and he doesn't quite know what to do, and he says, "I don't think I know it." And there's this entire exchange, and then he says something along the lines of, "Would you kindly remove your mask?" And then he goes, "Remove your clothes." And then he goes, "Remove your clothes, or would you like us to do it for you?" And it's a very interesting scenario because it is deliberately meant to give you this sense of, because what this film is actually based on, and I forgot to mention actually, is this film is actually based on a novel called Traumnovelle by Arthur Schnitzler, and he's an Italian novelist who wrote this book back in the 1800s, and the translation for Traumnovelle from the Italian is meant to be dream story. So that's actually kind of interesting because this moment in this film where Bill gets found out at this sort of like masked ball is sort of very evocative of a dream. Like there's a lot of, crossfades, which is sort of like the blending from one scene into another. They do it a lot in old-fashioned 1950s, 1930s films, like the films of Hitchcock and what have you, and Victor Fleming. But then you also have jump cuts where you very quickly cut from one thing to the other. And it's very quick, but it's meant to give you that sense of building tension. And it's very well done here because I feel like the crossfading is meant to give you the sense of the passage of time. Like this very slow passage of time. Whereas when the jump cuts happen is at the scene where he's being confronted. So when he's like having this tour of this palace of nymphomaniacs, he almost is, experiencing it like a dream, like almost time seems to stand still and you seem to flow from one thing to the other, and it's very kind of gradual and very smooth, and it's very almost slow and very almost relaxing almost in a very strange hypnotic way. But then of course it very quickly, cuts from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, when he's being confronted in that big ballroom scene. And it's cutting to all these very bizarre, very almost surreal and very scary looking Venetian masks. And this is intentional because it is meant to give you that impression of, of you having a dream almost. And it's giving you that sense of, oh yes, this is kind of like a nightmare we've all had where we've imagined ourselves running naked through a field. Although whenever I am, or whenever I have those dreams, it's usually me being chased by a bunch of Brussels sprouts after Christmas dinner. That's just a bit of a Christmas joke for you. Whenever I imagine myself running naked, it's usually through a field and being chased by Brussels sprouts after Christmas dinner. But yes, it's very surreal and very strange. But yes, it's kind of very similar to that. We've all had dreams where we've imagined ourselves either running naked or experiencing something of nakedness happening to us, like we're feeling vulnerable, we're feeling exposed, and that's kind of meant to be an indication that we feel very lost, or we feel very kind of, almost very vulnerable. Like I said, like that's basically our dream's way of saying to us, you're feeling vulnerable, you're feeling like you're struggling at the minute and you don't know quite what to do. You're feeling either, lost or demasculated or whatever, or you're feeling like you're struggling financially or anything like that. There's so many ways in which you can read into dreams, and that's what I think this scene is meant to represent, that sense that he's feeling vulnerable, and now he's feeling vindicated with his vulnerability, because now he's in a place where he can no longer hide. He now has to confront his vulnerability and the sense that he feels inadequate as a man because he can't strip his clothes when he's being, asked to do so. But then a woman saves him, and the cardinal gives him a warning that if you've told anyone about what you have seen, there will be drastic consequences for you and your family. So Bill quite rightly leaves, but then things start to change. He then starts to hear that Nick, the guy who he met at the party, the musician who he used to go to medical school with, he's been, abducted by two big bouncer-looking men, a story relayed by Alan Cummings as sort of like the hotel concierge guy, and of this, Nick character. And then it's also revealed that the prostitute who was in Victor's bathroom had OD'd at the party. But not only that, but the prostitute that he went out with a couple of hours before has actually come back with a test result saying that she's HIV positive. So there's all sorts of dark things happening, and you're thinking to yourself, is this the result of this Venetian ball? And it turns out that to a certain degree, the Venetian ball did have something to do with it, but not in the way you'd expect. Because it turns out that towards the end of the film, Victor was there. He had seen everything, and he basically confronts Bill about going there, and he says the whole thing was fake. The whole thing was set up, it was all staged, and it's okay. But then Bill confronts him and says, well, this woman OD'd in the morgue, and I saw her. Was she at the party, and was she at the masked ball last night? And she goes, well, yes, she was a hooker. And he goes, well, what kind of a fake or what's kind of a charade ends with someone ending up dead? And he goes, well, let's just cut the bullshit. She was a junkie. Like, she was someone who, OD'd in my bathroom. And then, of course, when she did the sacrifice thing that you were jerking yourself off to, Bill, all the time, it was all just staged, but she basically went back, they shagged her brains out, and then they took her home in a taxi. That's all that happened. Nothing else happened. And he's more at ease, but then Victor does something quite sly, which I thought was very interesting, and this is what I miss about films nowadays, which is where Victor actually puts his hands on Bill's shoulders, but he's not doing it in a very friendly kind of pally way, like with my mates or with anyone that I know. I'd usually just pat them on the shoulder with one hand. He puts both his hands on his shoulders, so that and he comes at him from behind, almost as a warning, like saying, "Don't do this again, Bill. Otherwise, I won't be here to save you, or something worse might be happening to you afterwards." So it's almost like a way of subtly warning him. Well, not really subtly, because he's putting both his hands on his shoulders. And that's something that you would usually do before you put your hands around someone's throat. That's the kind of, impression that I got with that scene. So he's almost like warning them. And he says something really quite telling in that moment. He goes, well, but hey, life goes on, but then you knew that, didn't you? And then a very good use of the jump cut happens here, where it goes from that scene to a quick cut of the Venetian mask on the pillow, where, Bill usually is next to his wife. So that's him basically having some explaining to do when he gets home. And I'm sorry for the constant movement of the camera. I'm actually filming this on my laptop, and I'm actually putting the laptop on my lap. So I'm sorry for all the movements, but that's just kind of how I decided to do this review. But yes, this was a very good film. I really loved it. I thought it was a really interesting exploration of relationships, and it was very well done. And I like the fact that even though a lot of the conversations are very kind of standard conversations that you would have in real life, there's something odd about the dialogue. There's something just slightly off or slightly dreamlike, I suppose you could say, about the dialogue. Like the line I said earlier where one of the girls goes, "Where the rainbow ends," when he asks, "Where are we going?" Or there's so many other lines of dialogue that I think are really brilliant in that way, where it does feel like it does feel like very classical dialogue or very casual everyday dialogue, but then there's little moments of there's something very off about the dialogue. I can't really quite place it, but there's something just slightly off, almost like it's happening in a dream, and it's very well done. And I like another detail that I think is very interesting is that Bill Harford is a doctor, and he constantly shows his credentials like he's an FBI agent. I really do like that because it's like a way of him sort of like proving that he's a doctor, or like he's investigating this grand mystery, almost like a giallo, like an Italian giallo film, except no one really dies, or people do die, but it's not done in a very giallo style fashion. There's a lot of scandal and there's a lot of tragedy, but there's no blood or gore, and I actually kind of find that really interesting. So there's a lot of interesting little details here. But one little detail I do want to mention as well before we click off is this was sadly the last film that Stanley Kubrick was officially involved in before his passing in 1999, and it's actually really sad because now we no longer will have these kinds of films where these characters will have these very long-winded conversations and characters will play with props as a means of demonstrating who their characters are in the grand scheme of things. Like, the only time when I've actually seen this kind of playing with props for the sake of blocking was used effectively was in the first Avengers film, when Tony Stark is talking to Loki and he's explaining, what they are and what they're planning to do. And he's saying that with the Avengers, or that's what we call ourselves, Tony Stark, played by the wonderful Robert Downey Jr., basically goes over and grabs a whiskey bottle off the table, and he essentially removes the decanter and he starts pouring whiskey. And he's probably thinking to himself without saying anything, right, I'm talking to the Norse god of mischief, Loki, and I need to prepare myself, so I'm going to get myself a whiskey and I'm going to pour it in. And I like stuff like that. That was the only moment where I found myself, there's a little bit of classical cinema in there, right there, where he just pours the drink and he's like, yeah, I'm talking to Loki, I'm going to drink myself a whiskey. And I really like it. And what I really think is wonderful is that this film it has a lot of Christmas decorations, and a lot of people are saying to themselves, is this a Christmas movie? Kind of in the same vein that you would ask the question, is Die Hard a Christmas movie? Is Gremlins a Christmas movie? Is even Home Alone a Christmas movie? But here's the thing, it all kind of comes together in the final line, which is Nicole Kidman as Alice says, it doesn't matter what happened or what didn't happen, all that matters now is that it was all a dream and we're awake now. And that's basically her saying, it doesn't matter what happened this Christmas, last Christmas, the Christmas before, or even Christmases yet to come. We're just simply lucky to be here in the present and lucky to be alive. And that's kind of what Christmas is all about. Like, looking back on the present, the past with fun nostalgia, looking forward to the future with some degree of optimism, and preparing for the future, preparing for the new year, but then at the same time we're also enjoying the present where we're together with our families and we're simply lucky to be alive. So that's my thoughts on Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, and I look forward to doing more Stanley Kubrick films for you guys in the future. And I also want to say one more thing, because this is just a geeky part of me coming into play now. I love the scene with Victor in the final scene with Victor and Bill in the sort of like pool room, where he's sort of like playing with the snooker balls and he's sort of like playing with a whiskey bottle and pouring him a drink, and I love stuff like that. I love the fact that he plays with the white ball and he sort of like taps it twice, and then he sort of like plays with the sort of thing that you'd sort of like shave the snooker cue or the sort of stick with to play pool with. I love how he's sort of like playing with that and he taps that twice, because that's almost like an indication to the director, like, move the camera this way, follow Victor this way. And I really love that. That's a really good way of kind of showing that Stanley Kubrick was almost like a military man in regards to how he directed films. And there's one thing that was said about Stanley Kubrick. He didn't make many films, but when he made films, he really made films. And I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Sorry it's a little bit more laid back than usual, and sorry for the constant tilting of the camera. I'm just in a very laid back mood this morning. So I hope you're all doing very well. I hope you all have a very good Christmas if I don't make any more reviews. But I will be doing more reviews because it's Christmas. Why wouldn't I? But I also will be making a video for all sorts of different things. But I will be making a review for Home Alone, which will be coming either later on today or tomorrow morning. But I hope you're all doing very well. I hope you're having a very wonderful, very safe Christmas. And I hope you're all having a very good day. Let me know what you think of Eyes Wide Shut in the comments below. And if you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And that's all for now. Take care. Bye for now.